Good afternoon, everyone. We're so glad that you could join us on this Tuesday afternoon to learn about risk behaviors during severe weather events. My name is Tracy Sempier. I'm the Coastal Resilience Engagement Specialist here at the Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant Consortium, and we are so pleased to be able to host three amazing presenters this afternoon that have been conducting research the past few years on this. Just to let you know how the format of the webinar is going to work, we have Kyle Halstead who is logged in and he's ready to help you if you need technical assistance during the webinar. Kyle can direct message you through the chat. If you have a question during the webinar, if you have a Q&A function, we can see it that way. We can also see it if you put it in the chat box. So we'll look for both of those things. And so at the very end, we'll take questions, and Christiana Allen, who's also with us today, is going to help moderate those questions. And then if you'll hang on to the very end, we do have a quick survey evaluation we would like for you to complete for us, and we will drop that in the chat box so that you can reach it. This webinar is being recorded, so if we had anyone that was not able to be with us today, or if you would like an opportunity to go back and revisit some of the information, we will have it available on our Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant site, and that's a YouTube site, and you will receive a link to that about a week after the webinar. So I think that does it for most of the housekeeping. And I'm just going to move straight into introducing our presenters. Whoops. Or not. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Keeps wanting to go back and forth. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start off by introducing Dr. Matthew Van Dyke. Dr. Van Dyke is an associate professor in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations. He's also the faculty lead for the Alabama Science Communication Initiative. He's a senior fellow with the Office for Research and Economic Development, and he's a faculty fellow with the Global Water Security Center and the Alabama Water Institute, all at the University of Alabama. So Dr. Van Dyke's research examines processes, effects, and problems associated with the public communication of science and environmental risk information. And he is currently investigating how public relations operates in science and environmental risk contexts and opportunities to build theory and enhance practice around public relations, science communication, environmental communication, risk communication, and media psychology concepts and theories. So welcome, Dr. Van Dyke. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Corey Armstrong. She is an Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Affairs at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's College of Journalism and Mass Communications. She has secured grants totaling more than $650,000 to study media messaging and severe weather and climate resilience. Her research combines traditional and emerging media and focuses on how individuals use media to make decisions during weather events, which she'll be talking about today. Her studies highlight the often unmet evacuation and safety needs of vulnerable populations during weather emergencies, specifically floods, hurricanes, and tornadoes. So welcome, Dr. Armstrong. And then last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Brian Britt. Dr. Britt is a research computing lead for the College of Communication and Information Sciences and an associate professor in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations. His research primarily focuses on the intersection between organizational communication and new media, with a particular emphasis on the strategies employed by individuals positioning themselves in online organizations and the ways in which those organizations evolve over time. As a computational social science scientist, Dr. Britt connects large-scale data collection and management approaches with innovative statistical analyses in order to address social scientific problems and contexts that would otherwise be intractable. So welcome, Dr. Britt. We're so excited to have the three of you here with us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Van Dyke.
Thank you so much. Let me see if I can share screen successfully. Let's see. Can everybody see my screen? Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for spending just a little bit of time today with us to talk about risk behaviors during severe weather events. And thank you for that very nice introduction. Before we get going, I want to thank Sea Grant, Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant, for the opportunity to conduct this research. So without the Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant support for this research would not exist, and definitely not at the scale that we're able to report on today. So super excited to be here today. And probably as our titles and backgrounds suggest, the particular types of behaviors that we were interested in and are often interested in are communication and information behaviors. And again, for this, specific to severe weather events before, during, and after those events. And so this is primarily the large overarching question that we were really looking at. So if you take any given severe weather event, and let's say before, during, and after that severe weather event, there's a lot of communication and information dissemination and exchange that's happening. And so broadly speaking, we were really interested in this ecosystem. So the folks who are making decisions, so perhaps many of you on the webinar today are folks who are deciding this is when we should put sandbags up, or this is when we should close off this road in this community. Those types of decisions that impact the public. We were interested in folks who are authority, formal or informal, decision makers, what their communication habits and preferences are around these severe weather events. And then on the flip side of that, we were also interested in people who might be listening to those sources, might not be listening to those sources, and trying to figure out the public who is obviously impacted by these severe weather events. Where do they go to for information? Who do they talk to? And again, taking this all together, are there synergies between decision makers and the public in relation to communication information? Are there tensions or challenges or opportunities? Again, that's a pretty lofty goal to set out, but essentially that's what we were trying to uncover, both for theory, but more importantly, to try to make this ecosystem better, presumably when we encounter other severe weather events. And so in order to do this, we kind of divided our research up into three separate phases. So the first thing that we wanted to do is try to take a look at social media, publicly available data, and see what conversations around severe weather events look like. After that, we were wanting to do a deeper dive. So some qualitative research in the form of interviews and focus groups with both decision makers and the public to try to, again, get a more nuanced, deeper understanding of those communication and information habits and preferences. And then finally, taking information we gleaned from social media and from qualitative conversations, do a broader survey with the public, again, to try to get a more generalizable understanding. And I should say this is with members, decision makers, and members of the public who are along coastal regions, the southernmost emergency management areas in Mississippi and Alabama. So today, Dr. Britt's going to talk about our initial social media analysis results. Dr. Armstrong is then going to talk about initial results from our interviews and focus groups with both decision makers and the public. And our survey is launching within the next week or two. So we'll have more results to share, more even with the social media and the qualitative data. We'll have more research to share than what we are sharing with you today. So at the end of the presentation, there's a QR code, and you can stay connected. And we're happy to share any of these results or talk even beyond today's conversation even more. So having said that, I will now turn it over to Dr. Britt to talk about our social media research.
Thank you very much, Dr. Van Dyke. So if we move to our next slide here, it goes without saying that on social media, people talk. They discuss the issues that are of critical importance to them. So it stands to reason that when a hurricane is coming to town, people are going to discuss that because a hurricane has significant impact on their day-to-day lives, or any severe weather event that's going to be a cause of disruption will end up being a source of considerable attention within that geographic geographic area. And we have a general sense of the overarching ways in which people go about that discourse. They may share information amongst one another to help guide their decision making. Things like whether or not they should evacuate at a particular point in time, when or if they need to take shelter, other caregiving types of options that they may be debating between any preparation actions. Things like that are certainly of key importance. They may ask questions to get clarity about what they can anticipate or what has happened or what is going to occur related to a particular severe weather event. They may engage in sense making with one another about that event. They may offer condolences to their fellows online for whatever they have lost along the way, so on and so forth. Again, these are general issues that people typically would discuss in relation to a severe weather event that wouldn't be entirely surprising to observe in any particular context. But we don't have a finer grained understanding of the specific topics that tend to emerge, how those tend to vary on case-by-case basis, certainly. And in particular, we also don't have the greatest understanding of how this discourse evolves over time relative to the development of these severe weather events. How does the discourse evolve in tandem, and how do people's needs end up driving those shifts in the discourse? And so this is part of what we wanted to begin addressing with this first phase of our project, focusing on social media. So if we turn then to our next slide here, we can talk briefly about the data that were collected for this part of the project. We started by examining 3 hurricane events and the discourse around those events as they occurred on what at the time was the Twitter social media platform, which is now X. We were focusing for this part of the project on Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Sally, and Hurricane Zeta, 3 fairly severe hurricanes that occurred in a time span just a few years apart from one another. To ensure comparability between our 3 hurricanes, we collected the same time range of data around each of the individual weather events. So we started our data collection window 14 days before each of the hurricanes made landfall and ended it 120 days after that starting point. So we had a full 4 months essentially of data relative to each of the hurricanes, in which we collected data specifically related to those hurricanes, what people were saying about that specific weather event. So we had these 3 distinct data sets that we were analyzing. For each of those data sets, we assessed the changing volume of tweets made over time in order to identify distinct periods that emerged in the discourse, to see what the inflection points were that demarcated distinct points in time, distinct aspects of the discourse. And we found that across these 3 hurricane events, they were generally divided into 4 overarching periods. You had naturally a period of anticipation prior to the event, when it had been forecast, when people were still determining what the severity of the event was likely to be, taking preparatory actions. This is that anticipation of it, where the discourse started fairly slowly at first, but then rapidly increased as the event became increasingly close, as it became clear that action may need to be taken, as the severity became increasingly clear as well from increasingly accurate forecasts. This activity rapidly escalated toward an extreme peak, as you can see in the example I've shown here for Hurricane Michael on the bottom right of this screen. It rapidly increased toward that severe peak, which occurred around the time that the storm made landfall, and particularly around the time that it began hitting populated areas. Immediately after that, we have the period of aftermath, where after the hurricane event has occurred, after it has done the most significant damage that it's going to do, the discourse quickly declines, where people no longer have to talk about what might happen. Instead, people begin to discuss what has occurred, what has the fallout ultimately been of this hurricane event, what damage has been done, what lives have been lost, even what inconveniences there may have been along the way, disruptions to work and life, things of this nature. Gradually, then we have a return to normalcy that proceeds afterward, where people begin to have much more waning discourse about this because there's not much more to discuss. Other topics start to take precedence. The major relief efforts tend to have subsided at this point in time, and so there's still some discussion about some of the long-term implications of the hurricane in question, but there's not nearly as much as people are transitioning away from a topic that has already been long covered at that point. And finally, the last phase is the effective absence of discourse, where there's just nothing more to say on this topic. People have not quite forgotten the event, but it's certainly not at the forefront of their minds in the same way that it was in the immediate periods surrounding the hurricane event. So it all but ceases to be mentioned at all. To explore these time periods a little bit further, if we move on now to our next slide, we constructed concept maps representing each of, we move back one slide, thank you. We constructed concept maps representing each of the key periods of discourse around each of the three hurricanes. It's worth noting here that for the, excuse me, for the fourth and final period, generally speaking, we were not able to construct concept maps simply because there wasn't enough social media activity, enough data to feed into the analysis to even build a concept map. So for the first three periods relative to each hurricane, we were able to directly compare what was actually being said about the hurricane event in question, starting with that first period of anticipation, where again, the discourse tended to emphasize a lot of preparedness for the hurricane event itself. There was a clear focus on trying to stay safe in advance of the hurricane. So for Hurricane Michael, for example, there was a great deal of emphasis on forecasts of the path of the storm itself and the anticipated scale of destruction, as you might expect, really focusing on some of the meteorological aspects of the hurricane and the implications for human life. For Hurricane Sally, and Hurricane Zeta, given the timing in late 2020, there were some specialized nuances to the topic that ended up coming to bear. And for Hurricane Sally, there was much more of an added emphasis on the role the government needed to play in managing the crisis, as well as some of the impact on the broader community, which may have been because this was at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so there was much more of an emphasis of what is the government going to do about any particular crisis, and how is the community as a whole going to be affected, just because we had been dealing with that at that point for months on end, just relative to a very different sort of crisis. For Hurricane Zeta, coming right before the presidential election, a lot of the discourse focused on very situation-specific concerns, including possible impacts for that election, as well as what implications the possible loss of power and other major infrastructural elements might have had on that key societal event. Moving on then to our next slide for period number 2, looking at the aftermath of the event. Again, as noted before, the discourse here tended to emphasize what the observed damage was. So no longer really projecting risk, but assessing what damage had actually occurred, as well as recovery efforts that were beginning and being undertaken in the meantime. So for Hurricane Michael, a lot of cleanup work really took precedence, people providing updates about those relief efforts and just generally discussing implications and naming some of the victims of the storm that had been claimed by it. For Hurricane Sally, much more of an emphasis was placed on sharing media, providing social media activity across platforms, giving news updates, showing your pictures, providing almost a degree of shock value relative to this event that had transpired. And for Hurricane Zeta, that focus was substantially more on the tangible impact of the hurricane. So what a specific damage had occurred, debris that had been strewn about, any flood damage that had been personally experienced. As noted before, the loss of power was still a relevant concern, partially in relation to concerns about the upcoming presidential election, but also for the sake of individuals' homes and the businesses that they needed to engage in. Finally, moving on to our third period, with much of the relief effort finally completed at this point in time, a lot of the discourse tends to shift, as we found, toward just reflecting on the event and the long-term implications for the people who are left behind. What do we do in the long-term aftermath once the event has occurred? For Hurricane Michael, a lot of this focused on individuals' families and the implications for the local community as a whole. In Hurricane Sally, there were some posts that talked just kind of critically about the long recovery time, how long it was actually taking for recovery to happen, again, in relation to certain other societal events that were happening around that point in time, as well as Hurricane Zeta, which was rapidly coming up at this point. Some people were addressing their lingering needs, things that had not yet been addressed, while others still focused on trying to share media, getting attention for themselves and their own experiences, their own social media activity. Finally, for Hurricane Zeta, there was much more of a fragmented conversation dealing with a wide range of different concerns, such as power loss, property damage, disruptions to their individual school and work experiences. So much more of an emphasis on the individual case. What has happened to me specifically? How is it affecting my life? As opposed to a more cohesive narrative that tended to manifest. But again, this was still focusing on what was transpiring in the long term, well after the immediate crisis relief efforts had already been resolved. Moving onward then to our next slide. To build on this assessment that you see here, we're planning to continue this analysis of the social media activity by conducting a sentiment analysis of these tweets in order to illustrate how the emotional valence around the discourse evolved over time. Certainly, we're not expecting that there will suddenly, at a particular point in time, be a parade in the streets celebrating any of these hurricanes, yet the degree of negativity or the degree of lamentation relative to these hurricane events certainly may have changed and waxed and waned at various points in time. And they've likely mapped onto some of the shifts in tweet volume and the discursive themes that we observed, but we need to know exactly how this actually transpired. We're also going to compare the results for these hurricanes against other severe weather events, such as tornadoes, which are fundamentally different in nature. Tornadoes obviously have far narrower forecast windows, and so we'll likely see significant differences in how that anticipation phase unfolds. There may consequently be differences in some of the ways in which the aftermath emerges once the event has actually transpired. Once we take these findings together, these findings will inform some of the official public communication interventions that happened prior to hurricane events, to the weather events as a whole, I should say, during those events to help the community at large, and in the aftermath to help guide and facilitate some of those crisis relief efforts. And with that, in building on some of the social media activity, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Armstrong, who will talk a bit about some of our work focusing on a more qualitative angle.
All right, thanks, Brian. I appreciate that. And thanks you all for coming, and I hope this is an enjoyable opportunity for you. It occurs to me, one quick thing in my own personal background that I wanted to mention. It occurs to me that you all might go, why is she from Nebraska and actually involved in this? Just for clarification, I was at the University of Alabama until we started this project, and about midway in the middle of the project, I came up here to Nebraska. So it's really interesting to think about this a little further away, but yet it's still been really interesting to connect with it. So to get back to the project, to more important matters, I wanted to talk a little bit about how these things interact a little bit. So the last phase was very much social media oriented, and again, the kinds of conversation that was being had online. And so what we then wanted to do was kind of dig deep, not into any specific events per se, but people that live through these kinds of emergencies and disasters, for lifelong reasons, and they've been there forever. So I'm going to focus today on the focus groups themselves. We did 4 focus groups, and we also did about 25 interviews with the decision makers in those areas. And so we don't have those today. I thought actually this, given this webinar, the more interesting piece was going to be the conversation, the focus groups that we actually had with the members of the public. So that's what I'm going to talk about for a bit. And specifically, I wanted to talk about how they get their information. So one of our key metrics here was to think about how do people gather information, and how do they use that information to make decisions about what to do during these severe weather events, these hurricanes. Are they going to evacuate? What kind of information do they need to do that? And we specifically wanted to look at media as a player here, because again, media are key information sources during these emergencies. So how do these groups in the southeastern U.S., specifically Alabama and Mississippi, how do they view media? How do they compare media outlets to other information sources? And how might different groups view these information sources differently? And then what are the disconnects among these groups? And so that's what I want to talk about a bit today. So next slide, please. So again, we mentioned 4 focus groups in July of 2024. We did this, and we had 22 participants, and they were very much in the very southern coastal communities of Alabama and Mississippi. One of the focus groups that we did was at a local media outlet. So it was very much, we kind of had a comparison to look at how the media's viewpoint was, and then how others viewed media. And we talked a little bit about that. Just a few demographics about who those folks were. Again, of the 22, you can kind of see there we had various genders, various races. One limitation is that we did not have any African Americans, and I do think that was a limitation. We tried very hard to grapple with that, and we were able to get some African Americans in the interviews, so that was one of the ways we worked around that. But for this particular data collection presentation, where we do not have any African Americans in this group. Next slide, please. So what were the basic questions that we looked at in these focus groups? And you can kind of see them there, but essentially, again, we asked each group kind of who are your key information sources when there's a severe weather event? And then, so again, both interpersonal, media, online, public officials, etc. And then what is it about these sources that make them trustworthy to you? And then finally, again, are there any sources that are distrustworthy to you, and why is that? And then where do traditional media fit into your personal, or these individuals, their personal information repertoire? And then finally, this is that kind of blanket one between how do media producers feel and how do their answers compare to other members of the public regarding the severe weather coverage. So those were kind of our key metrics going in. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a bit about each one and give you a little bit of an example. I'm not going to read this verbatim, but those are kind of comments. Those are a specific example of some of the information that we found. So again, in terms of the first research question, we really learned that media are not the most trusted information sources according to many of these these groups. So if you're thinking about what does that mean? I mean, again, the idea is some folks definitely trust them. We had some folks definitely said, hey, we really like media. We use it. This is where I go. But particularly when you get into these vulnerable communities, these non-white populations, these folks that are non-English speakers, so non-native speakers, and again, lesser educated, they generally were not trusting media because they felt that, again, it doesn't represent them. They don't see themselves reflected in this media content, and they also don't feel that it's accurately reflecting what their community happens to look like. So, for example, this particular comment that we received, they were concerned about media hype, and that what they see on, say, the Weather Channel, they see, and you all have probably seen this before, Jim Cantore or another weather forecaster standing there in the pouring rain, and they're, geez, you shouldn't be out here right now. And 10 miles away, where these people may have been sitting, they're saying it's fine. This doesn't look like us, or this isn't something I'm concerned about. So they went to other sources, which was really fascinating to see. We had some folks that very much trusted their local public officials. They felt that that person and those, say, those public officials were more fair and more unbiased in their, in their reads of what the situation was. And essentially, if that person said they should evacuate, they were going to evacuate, but otherwise that's not what's going to happen. So, and that was a really interesting finding. Next slide, please. So when we get into the second research question, again, I'm going to hit a little more on that media hype. And one of the challenges are exactly what I was talking about, that folks that are living in the situation, they've been living through these kinds of events, and some of them have said, we are not going to evacuate. We're in a place we're on an island. We can't very easily move. And it's just as easy for us to stay here, and we're not going to do that. And then what they would learn is they'd get a phone call from somebody who was, say, in, nowhere near southern Alabama or Mississippi. And in fact, they get a phone call and say, hey, you need to get out of there because look what's on the TV. And in fact, that's not what's reflective. So they felt very distrustworthy. I mean, I felt that was really specific when they were saying, don't believe what you see in the media. That's not what's happening here. And that was an interesting thing to think about too. The element of certainly what sells, what gets more media, attention is the more disaster related or the more intense it looks like. So, a calm storm that doesn't actually have much storm surge is not going to generate as much media interest. And that's kind of something we have to think about. What are the different kinds of, what are the agenda of all the different kinds of information sources that we have here? Next slide, please. So tackling the third research question, we want to talk about the fact that there's comprehension issues with a lot of these information sources. So I mentioned a bit about the non-native speakers, and this was a big one for them. If they're not native English speakers, understanding the different jargon that might come up, they don't necessarily understand. I mean, they may not be English speakers at all, and the words don't make sense to them, and all they can see are pictures. And if there's not pictures, then they don't really know what to make of the media content. So these folks were talking about that they in fact go to others to ask them to translate. So they have kind of their public opinion leaders are folks that can translate that information to them because they don't understand what they're seeing in media. So I don't know where to go. I don't know where my shelter would be. So they have to have someone essentially translate that the information to get to them. So media is not something that they're looking at very much at all. They're really calling their opinion leaders, their trusted sources, and those folks are not generally going to be media. One of the comments that came up related to this was, again, the idea that not a lot of the material that comes out related to severe weather is actually translated into other languages that may be more effective for the different populations that they have. Next slide, please. And then finally, I mentioned I wanted to talk a little bit about the news producers and versus how they view their media needs and their content. And that was a fascinating discussion that we had there. And there was a huge disconnect among the news producers that we talked to versus the other members of the public. The news producers felt that there were no comprehension issues. They felt that would not do kind of a general story about hurricane season is upon us. What will we do? Because it's not going to be effective for their particular client, their readers, their subscribers. They felt that they just cover the hurricanes when it happens, and that's what you do. And there's no real need for long-term preparation per se. And that's essentially, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but essentially that is not a good use of news content and page views and things like that. The one thing that they talked a lot about is that they do media feel strongly, these media consumers or these media producers that we talk to, they felt very strongly though that when these kinds of events happened, the paywalls need to come down and that they put the content out for free because it's important that that's how they get that information out there. And I thought that was a really important point to think about, is that there is a level of understanding that in fact some of these, that we need to get as much information out as quickly as we can, regardless of the paywalls and things like that. So that was a fascinating finding. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about, when you start thinking about this and you start thinking about how does this connect to social media and where we're going to go next? Well, again, there is this disconnection that we talked about in terms of media and others. We've certainly talked about the difference of these socially vulnerable populations and how are they getting information. There's certainly more to see about that, to look at there. We really want to connect that to the interviews that we did with some of the decision makers to figure out how these findings compared with some of the conversations we had with them. And also, if you go back to the social media elements that we talked about previously, it's important to think, okay, who were the folks that were tweeting? I mean, to get into a little more about the general of the tweets, but let's talk about who were they, where were they, how much experience do they have related to severe weather? Because again, that level of experience, that prior experience with severe weather, which is who a lot of these folks happen to be, the people that we were talking to in the focus groups, they have lived in these areas for their entire life. So it's very important. They feel that they have a level of expertise that, say, other populations may not. So I think that's going to be an interesting comparison group when we look at the social media data and compare that as well, and then get into the survey data that we'll talk to later on. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Van Dyke and go from there.
Thanks, Dr. Armstrong and Dr. Britt. Hopefully this, if nothing else, whetted your appetite for even more of the information that we'll be able to share at a later date. But building from both the social media research and the interview and focus group research, we're in the midst of launching a broader survey that will go out to, I think we're on target to recruit more than 600 participants from, again, coastal Mississippi and Alabama. Again, building from the research that we've conducted and some more practical questions that have emerged as a result of the research that we've done up to this point, but also we can't get away from the theory. So some of the theoretical stuff that would also hopefully translate into useful practice as well. But again, that will be coming. And again, if you are interested in any of what we've talked about, I would encourage you to scan the QR code on the screen. It will take you to a very brief Qualtrics questionnaire that, if you're just interested in the social media results or the qualitative research, or if you're interested in hearing about what we find with our survey when that becomes available, you can select all of it, select some of it. We'll be happy to stay in contact with you. And again, if you're interested in reaching out to us for a deeper conversation, we're getting ready to open it up for Q&A for the remaining time that we have. But you have our email addresses here on the screen. We'd love to chat with you or be helpful in any way. Or if you're interested in collaboration, we're always happy to chat with any folks and figure out how we can translate our research into useful practice, particularly if it'll help you do your job better in this context. So with that, thank you again for your time and attention, and look forward to any discussion that we have here in the Q&A.
All righty, so we have one question so far in the Q&A and one in the chat. The first question is from an anonymous attendee, and they asked, did any of the studies address the impact of deliberate dis or malinformation, especially during the recovery phase, as we saw after Hurricane Helene in North Carolina?
I can take that one. And again, Dr. Armstrong, Dr. Britt, you all chime in at any point. We didn't necessarily, so the way that we set up our study was to allow those types of themes to emerge if they were salient to the participants, but we didn't want to lead or focus specifically on mis and disinformation if it didn't come up. Anyone else want to chime in there?
Yeah, just to speak a little bit further to that, as Dr. Van Dyke noted, we didn't explicitly direct our focus toward dis or misinformation. I frankly had expected that might emerge within some of these social media data, just because if you think of where mis and disinformation emerged today, that's generally where that tends to happen. It was a little bit surprising to not see a higher prevalence of that in some of the data that we were we evaluate it. Now we're still doing some analyses. Maybe we'll end up seeing some glimpses of that, but it didn't have as much of a significant presence in these data around at least these specific crises as one might have anticipated, particularly given that two of the events that were analyzed with the social media data were right around election season. Again, somewhat surprising there wasn't a bit more of that, but that there wasn't nearly as much as I would have anticipated, at least.
And I'll just add from the focus groups that we discussed. I mean, the media distrust was not anything specific, as I said, that was related to misinformation. It was just more a general concern that I don't see me in media. I don't see that this talks to me or that I'm able to talk back to it in any way so that lack of interaction, but it wasn't anything related to the disinformation kind of campaigns that were going on.
Alrighty, we have another question. Did you get a sense that non-native speakers see it as their responsibility to help others in their family and friend groups, since the media is not doing a good job of that, in their opinion?
Yeah, I'll tackle that one. If you're okay, Dr. Van Dyke, I'll tackle that. You can feel free to chime in. Yes, I think that's exactly what was going on. It was really interesting because we did two focus groups back to back, and one was very much there's a large Vietnamese population in that area, and that was a group that we talked to versus a different population that was very much native speakers. And it was as if literally asked them different questions. It was so stunning, that difference in the way that they gather information and get what they need to kind of get the sufficient information they need to make a decision. And very much it was, they have their core group of one of the I remember one of the folks, one of the respondents said that she said, I'll hear the information, and I'm first gen here in the US, and I tell my mother, who then broadcasts it to her 12 closest friends that are in the neighborhood, and because she's a Vietnamese speaker. And so that's kind of the way that's happened. And that was a very common way to do it, is they have that's who their information sources are. And it's really interesting. So again, it's as if it's a completely different network of information from what others, how others are getting their information. It was fascinating to see.
And I'll just add to that, even in some of the interviews, you also saw that theme continue. So what we might label quote unquote underserved audiences, that is very much the dynamic. Is there's kind of this formal or informal network of local communities who really help each other out in ways that kind of supplement this broader official effort very much.
Okay, this next question is a two-parter. So the first part of the question is, to what degree does or did weather salience impact decision-making of some of the people who experienced the storms?
You have thoughts on that, Dr. Britt? Or Dr. Armstrong, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm assuming you mean, I guess I'm envisioning what that means. Weather salience is kind of like weather enthusiasts, people who are kind of more excited about weather, and I'm one of those folks. So I that's how I'm envisioning it. And I will say that I think that was a good majority of some of the groups we had, is that they felt very informed. They felt like they knew where they were going to get their information. And I don't want to use the word excited, like I'm an enthusiast per se, but because of the life they live and I guess not so much the life they live, but where they live, they knew that being involved with weather and understanding kind of how it works, what storm surge is like, that's part of their part of their lifestyle per se. And and that's a little bit different than some of the transient elements that we talked about, some other instances that folks that were new to the area and how they worked with it. And what was interesting is we did some groups in Alabama and we did some groups in Mississippi. And there were differences in the way they approached the information gathering process. So I do think salience is but I guess I was thinking about it in terms of enthusiasm, but salience could also be just how important is it to me because of my life, and I think that may be some differencing there. And I don't know, Dr. Van Dyke, that's where I'll go back to you and see if you had things to add.
I agree with your interpretation too, and I think it kind of gets my interpretation of the question also gets to what you were saying about them being quote unquote expert because they live it year in and year out too. That's the only piece I would add to that is there's that element of it. It's salient because they presumably deal with it and are expert in it in their own way. Too. So yeah, I do think it played a role, at least in how they interacted with and communicated.
Okay, so the second part of that question, and you may have already touched on it a bit with your previous answer, but did you find that people with higher degrees of weather salience shared information with others via social media?
Dr. Armstrong, you chime in if you have thoughts. It seemed like the folks who were connected, they had their and again this kind of goes to the formal or informal networks we talked about too. But I think in general, everyone that we talked to, they had their networks and they definitely shared or disseminated information. And again, some of that was more tangible or definable community networks. Some of it was potentially more informal with communities and when I say community, I mean community of meaning. So like subpopulations within a geographic area. They had their networks too, but yeah, I think it definitely influenced how they communicated.
One thought I had is that there was one group that very much there was one person who, like I said, was the expert about this. And when he was posting, people were like, okay, there's something going on. I need to go to his Facebook page and look at it and see what he's saying. And so but I thought that was really unique and it didn't come up anywhere else except for that, but that person was very well known about that. So that was a really interesting finding. That's the only one I can think of. Brian, did you have a chance to dig further into the social media to see like who were the main posters? Were they mainly media or were they mainly individuals or?
That's one of our subsequent steps we're going to be getting into that I didn't get deeply into during the talk today. But yeah, we're planning on looking at how the web or the network of interactions ultimately developed to see who the major players actually were spreading information to their followers, to their peer groups, and so forth. Essentially, who the key opinion leaders were in that conversation. We're not quite to that point yet, but that's on the agenda.
All righty, next question. How did the media groups discuss getting information out in other languages, if at all?
They did not. I mean that was a specific question that was asked, and the way we discussed it was, do you feel there are comprehension issues? I mean, what steps do you make? And they were not doing that, and that was a really fascinating thing. When I say there was a disconnect between that group and the other focus groups, it was really interesting. But I believe the answer I got to that particular question was that the population in that area did not lend itself to need additional other languages translated. I would say the census did not back that up so much, but those were the answers I got. And I'll just answer that question. I just happened to see come across since I'm here. Yes, there were people from Bayala Batre that were there. I can answer it that way. So.
And I'll also just add to what Dr. Armstrong. For me, one of the biggest takeaways in terms of practice is there does seem to be a big need for translation. Would you agree with that assessment, Dr. Armstrong? It does seem like an opportunity to better engage and serve the public.
Very much so.
Okay, and did your analysis include tweets in other languages such as Spanish?
So our study for this first part focused predominantly on English language content, just because, frankly, there was so much material, even in the English language. For Hurricane Michael, to put it in perspective, I think we had somewhere in the vicinity of 2.5 million tweets. I need to double check the exact number, but a fairly massive amount of data. Even with those constraints in place. Certainly that likely included some mixed content. You'll have tweets that are made that one might say are in Spanglish, like an amalgam of multiple languages. But we did focus, at least for this initial part, a bit more on the English language content, essentially just to have some constraints on the amount of data being pulled in to make an initial analysis a bit more feasible. But it would be worthwhile to incorporate tweets, incorporate data into other languages. I wouldn't even say so much to do an omnibus analysis, but more to contrast how people with different backgrounds and different language familiarity are engaging in the discourse in different ways, how their needs vary, and so forth. So more a comparative type of approach, as opposed to just adding them to the existing data set. I think evaluating the points of distinction in this case would be particularly useful, especially given some of what Dr. Armstrong's already highlighted.
Okay, and were people with disabilities included in any of the studies?
I'll just I would kind of say the same thing as I mentioned. For no one was excluded, but we didn't necessarily request that information. But we certainly didn't exclude anyone who again fit the sample and was willing to participate. But we didn't request that information specifically in the sampling procedure. But there were a couple of participants who actually made note, if I remember correctly, Dr. Armstrong, about accommodation type information. I don't remember the specific contributions that they brought up, but I don't know that they themselves had a particular disability that they acknowledged, but I do think some of them at least talked about that information in this context, if that helps.
Okay.
Sorry, I'll just add, sorry, Christina, Christiana, just one thing. I'll just add, if I remember correctly, I can think of two that labeled themselves as caregivers of others. And so I think that ties into the fact of disability as well.
And they specifically talked about challenges related to that. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Alrighty. After Sally and Zeta, local officials live streamed and posted updates on debris cleanup. How might local government's social media activity influence online discourse? Is this an effective way to communicate with individuals who distrust the media before and after severe weather?
So I'll put it this way. Not engaging in the social media conversation is a great way to sow that distrust, to make it much more pronounced. Being silent as the general public is going through a crisis is a terrible idea. So I wouldn't even say so much that it's useful to post on social media as it's a terrible idea to not do that. Um, it used effectively, certainly, social media can offer a great channel to get information, to get in advice out to the people who need it. That obviously needs to be done strategically so that you don't end up in a crying wolf situation where people stop listening because they no longer believe what you're saying. But at the same time, when crises are happening, something needs to be said, even if that something needs to be carefully tailored and targeted to deliver the right information to the right people at the right points in time.
Sorry. Sorry, I'll chime in. I muted myself again. Sorry. I'll chime in to just add that I do think here's one of the challenges. Yes, I think I agree with everything Dr. Britt just said, but I'll add that if you distrust media, you're not going to be looking on social media for that information. So the problem is, how do you get folks that distrust media to start looking at that information? Like, what is the campaign to get there? And the time to start is not during, before, during or after an event. It's when there's calm time, and you got to figure out how do you start to gain that trust in calm time so that they are going to trust you when it matters.
To build on what Dr. Armstrong just noted, some of that may connect back to some of what she was discussing previously, where you have opinion leaders in some of these communities who receive key pieces of information, and then they distill those insights to their peers, to their neighbors, to the dozen or so other individuals they personally know. It's sort of a two-step flow process where if you can get those opinion leaders to be engaged with the information that you're sharing, whether it's through social media or through some other outlet, then you can start to diffuse that information across the broader public. Now, if someone is completely disengaged with all forms of media, mass media, social media, everything, those are going to be people who are more challenging, at least to directly reach, but you can at least potentially get to the people who are talking to them. And so that ideally, I think, would be the aim that we should try to pursue here.
And building from what Dr. Britt said, I think our results, our overarching project results, particularly with the qualitative research, would lend support for that being an effective strategy in these regions. So it's clear, at least in the conversations that we had, that people seem to trust perhaps informal opinion leaders in these communities because they're local in the community with them as well. So it might be an efficient strategy, presumably because a lot of people, emergency managers and so forth, you need one more thing on your to-do list, right? So perhaps an efficient use of time and resources perhaps would be to try to identify, and presumably y'all are working with those formal and informal community leaders, and a lot of you, I'm sure, are opinion leaders in your community, but trying to help come together, as my colleagues have mentioned, proactively, and figuring out that strategy on the front end would seems like it would be worth the investment of time and or resources.
We have one more question if we can give a quick answer on this one. It says, what were the most prominent, if any, differences you noticed in information dissemination across generations? Were certain generations more likely to trust certain sources over others? Did you notice any disagreement around behavior choices within multi-generational groups or families? Who tends to be taking charge in these situations?
You have thoughts, Dr. Armstrong? We'll probably be able to uncover more of that in the survey, but you have thoughts?
I do have a couple thoughts. One is, it's not what you'd think, is how I would say it. What I saw was, think about with the non-native speakers, the younger generations, which are generally more more fluent, they are doing the translating, so they're doing a lot of the conversations with the elders in their community because they're translating into their language. So so there's that. And ironically, the older populations in what I would guess I would say a kind of a mainstream area, a very, I guess, homogenetic area, is they were more social media focused than I was expecting. So as I said, those in that regard, it was very different than I would have thought. But the only place that I thought generationally sat where I thought it was the media group, which I mean, I was both surprised and not surprised at that conversation in terms of what their views are in terms of where they get media. And it sounded a little more, I'm an old school journalist, so it sounded very much like sitting in a newsroom 20 years ago when I was sitting in a newsroom 20 years ago. So.
Alrighty, thank you so much for your answers. I'm going to pass it back to Tracy, and then we'll wrap up.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're at time. Brian, Corey, Matt, thank you so much for spending time talking to us today. And if you haven't had a chance to complete the survey that is in the chat box, please do so. If you were struggling to have access to it, we'll send it out in a follow-up email as well. We'd really love to know your thoughts and opinions. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.